And you should all have now seen the announcement that we are indeed being recorded. So once again, I've already rambled on here a bit more than perhaps is necessary, merely because I do abhor a vacuum. But welcome to our really urgent and I think quite exciting conversation on Hagia Sophia's conversions on the political, temporal, and aesthetic dimensions of heritage, hosted by the Empires of Memory research group, the Empires of Memory, the Cultural Politics of Historicity in Former Habsburg and Ottoman Cities, based at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Göttingen, though in this strangely deterritorialized and reterritorialized world that we live in, I happen to be in Zagreb, Croatia at the moment, so I greet you from there. I'm Jeremy, the leader of the group, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's event. Before beginning, I'd like to just extend a few thanks because, as ever, it's important to acknowledge the mutual labor that goes into hosting an event, even when Zoom makes it somewhat easier for us to gather together in this way. I'm sure that, like me, where you feel that one of the silver linings of the time of COVID-19 is this new ability to have conversations that might not actually occur if we were in person and not virtual. So I am quite pleased about that. I just want to thank a few people who were responsible for bringing this all together. Rami Higazi, who's with us, our wizard of all things I and T. Marina Chiselsky, who is our wizard of all things administrative. And then, of course, above all, I should mention Norbert Winiger, who put together the flyer on quite short notice, so I thank him. And finally, of course, the other members of Empires of Memory, without whom this would merely be my own idle and likely pointless sort of adventure of speculation. So Jelena Radovanovic, Cicek Ilengis, both of them were absolutely crucial to bringing everything together, as the participants already know, as well as Annika Kirbis, who couldn't be with us today due to some conflicts of interest. So I see that Karen has arrived as well. Welcome, Karen. So we've just begun our very brief opening remarks. I think since you're here, if it's okay, maybe we'll resume the original order just for order's sake. But as I mentioned, I will say a few more words before we begin, just to offer some frame and context and hopefully provocations for our conversation. A few more pointers. We're going to focus on the question and answer and discussion aspect of the event as much as possible. And once each of the presenters has delivered their brief remarks of approximately 10 minutes, perhaps a bit more, perhaps a bit less, I would then ask that each of you who has a question or a comment simply indicate that in the chat function to either to me personally or to all of us, it doesn't matter. And then when you ask your question, be sure to unmute yourself. But until then, please do keep your mute buttons on. And also a somewhat more specific matter, I do understand that one of our participants in the audience has some difficulty with sight, and so therefore we're going to describe the images that we share with a few words each time that we do share them as much as possible, although hopefully we'll remember to do that. Sometimes it can be difficult, but that's for one of our participants, just so that all of you know that's what's happening. So not to belabor you too much longer, but I do want to just offer a few more comments, and I'll share my screen now as well. If I can manage to do that before I turn it over to Karen. And I will introduce each of our 5 participants more thoroughly prior to each of their presentations, but I should say that we do welcome Karen Barkey, Axel Corlu, Emily Neumeier, Bissera Pentcheva, and Hakan Yavuz as our 5 discussants today, and we're really quite enthused and thrilled that they could join us. So let me just, as ever, I find it difficult to, for some reason, you're going to see my, now you're going to see my, you're going to see my email probably. Can you see my PowerPoint now? Great. So throughout its 1487-year history, Hagia Sophia, Hagia Sophia, has reliably been a crucible for political and religious mobilization, for religious and ethnic and national identification, and for aesthetic religious experience. It's a site that is constantly involved with the simultaneously the memory of politics. And I'm sure that many of us here in this conversation today share deep and genuine feelings about the space. Probably not all of us will agree, nor is this conversation meant to establish some agreement or consensus, but I would ask us to keep in mind the plurality of perspectives among our participants, even as we conduct our conversation today. As I think probably most of you realize, and you probably wouldn't be here otherwise, Hagia Sophia has been in the news quite a lot lately, and even the number of participants suggests that this is quite a timely issue to be discussing. On July 10th of this year, as again, I imagine most of you know, Hagia Sophia became a mosque yet again after the Council of State, the Danıştay in Turkey, revoked its museum status, which had been granted in 1934, at that time as an attempt to diffuse its imperial connotations and open the building to researchers. So I guess it's 86 years later, that early dispensation of the Turkish Republic seems to have passed the way of the proverbial dodo. So 2 weeks later, despite the COVID pandemic, which continues to keep us all in our houses and all in front of our screens, despite that, thousands of worshipers gathered to celebrate the opening with an initial Friday prayer. And the reopening of the mosque was the result, of course, of a long campaign, most recently led by the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, and President Erdogan, who had called for the reconversion of Hagia Sophia as a return to its origin. And in doing so, thus he initiated yet another recontextualization of the monument and the space, and the elevation of only one of its myriad histories. So that's the backdrop, and I'm sure that most of you are familiar with it. And against it, we want to raise at least three, and of course there are many more, but at least three major themes in relation to Hagia Sophia. So I'm going to show you a few, just a few images before I turn it over to our discussants. The first, I don't know if, well, I can't see my titles actually because of the nature of Zoom, but I doubt that's a problem. The first tension that we want to call attention to is that between the anti-imperialist rhetoric that surrounded much of the campaign to reconvert Hagia Sophia to a mosque, and the sort of images and symbolism of Reconquista that accompanied this reconversion once it actually happened in July. So here you can see two slides. On the one hand, an image that I just lifted from a website called, I believe it's dinihaber.com. I believe it's affiliated with graduates of the Imam Hatip schools in Turkey, but a headline saying Hagia Sophia hostage to imperialism. On the other hand, you have what would seem to be, at least on a very sort of immediate interpretation, quite an imperial image. Ali Erbash, the head of Diyanet, the Directorate of Religious Affairs in Turkey, clutching a sword as he rises the minbar to offer the initial khutbeh or sermon at the Friday prayer that constituted the reconversion of the mosque. So that's the first theme that we're sort of drawing attention to. And again, each of our participants, of course, will have their own multitude of insights and interpretations. This is more just the sort of general scaffolding for our conversation. As I say, scaffolding is, of course, an appropriate metaphor when you're talking about Hagia Sophia. I don't know if I've ever seen it without scaffolding, in fact. But the second major theme, and this is especially picking up on some of the work by Karen Barkey, is thinking through Hagia Sophia, as a shared sacred space, but also a contested sacred space. So here you have three images, and in fact, I've sort of, in some ways, integrated a variety of different points into this slide, simply because there isn't time to go through all of them at great length. You have the Pan-Hellenic dream. This is an image from the 1920s or 1910s approximately. I don't know, since I actually took a photo of the artwork myself in Thessaloniki a few years back, and I neglected to note the date. But you can see the sort of angelic and divine intervention, presumably that will reconvert Hagia Sophia not to a mosque, but to a church at that moment. You also see here a comparison of the interiors of Hagia Sophia and Belgrade's massive Sveti Sava church, which is only coming to completion this year. This is one of my, and perhaps also Jelena in our group's, pet projects, since Belgrade is another city that we examine quite closely. But as you can see, there's quite a resonance architecturally there. So there's something to be thought thought through in the way in which the very aesthetics and architecture of the church resonates across a certain Orthodox ecumene, as it were. And then finally, of course, you see an image of the first initial prayer in the reopened Hagia Sophia I Kabir Jami. So obviously there are many questions that we might ask. Is it possible to share a space among religions, or even between religiosity and secularity? Why is it indeed that the museum as a space has for so many actors in Turkey and beyond? These are all themes that I think we could spend a lot more time discussing. And then finally, and I'll just try to do this, we also want to call attention to the aesthetics, the historicity, and the experiential, phenomenological characteristics of the space, which anyone who has been there doesn't really need an introduction to, but indeed it has been, especially Bissera Pentcheva's work that's called attention to this vis-a-vis the Byzantine sort of phenomenology of the space, both acoustically and visually in recent years. So here you have an image of light pouring through Isidore and Anthemius's pendentive dome on one side, and then yet another image of the dome just as a placeholder. So there's something to be said here too about the aesthetics that emerge in the experience of the architecture and the spatiality of Hagia Sophia beyond all the discourses that perhaps try to establish it as one sort of place or another, to fix it, as it were, ideologically. So I'm going to stop there, and that's just, again, a sort of taster menu of some of the things we've been thinking about. And but really, I want to hear, of course, as I'm sure all of you do, from our participants. I'll stop sharing my screen if I can. There we go. And if Karen is with us, I'd like to invite you to unmute yourself, and I'll introduce you quickly, and we can then move forward. Are you here, Karen?
I am there. Hello?
Hello, hello, welcome.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, we can.
But I have lost all images in my computer, so I'm not really sure what's happening. I'm having a lot of trouble with Zoom lately, so I don't see anybody, anything, but as long as you hear me, I can talk, if that's okay. I don't have any visual.
I'm really sorry about that. We do hear and see you well, I think, at least I do, and I think that's true.
I think it came back. Okay, sorry. This has been a very, very rough few days in terms of Zoom. And I have to say, I apologize for being late, but I actually thought that this conversation was starting at 12 today, my time. And had my colleague Manuel not texted me, I would not have been here for this. So I'm a little off, but I will try to present within my time limit my thoughts about this.
I'm sorry. I'll just introduce you for.
Oh, so sorry.
Not that you need an introduction, but
no, I do need.
But nonetheless, if that's okay, I'm sorry that there was some confusion about the time. And good morning to the East Bay. I'm
Thank you.
There originally myself, as it happens, so it's always good to see the sunshine in autumnal California. Karen Barkey is the Haas Distinguished Chair of Religious Diversity at the Othering and Belonging Institute and Professor of Sociology at Berkeley, and currently Director of the Center for the Study of Democracy, Toleration, and Religion. She has been engaged in the comparative and historical study of the state with special focus on its transformation over time. Her main empirical site has been the Ottoman Empire in comparison with France, the Habsburg, and the Russian empires. This, of course, is right in line with the sort of work we do in our group. Her current research centers on shared sacred spaces, specifically Greek Orthodox churches and monasteries in Istanbul that continue to be shared by Christians, Muslims, and Jews. She co-edited Shared Sacred Sites, a contemporary pilgrimage, and co-curated the Shared Sacred Sites exhibit in Thessaloniki and New York, a wonderful intervention, which I had the really good fortune to see myself. So Karen, please, and again, sorry for any confusion.
Okay. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So I titled my presentation, whether it will ever be written or not, but Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom and the Politics of the Unwise. So since this latest transformation of Hagia Sophia Museum into a mosque, these agreements have been published by national and international institutions, politicians, scholars and pundits around concerns regarding the legitimacy of this conversion from museum to mosque. In many ways, the battle of Hagia Sophia is double-edged. It is political, but I think it's also deeply emotional. This is because more than religious or secular, Hagia Sophia is, in Pierre Nora's word, a site of memory. But I take it to be a site of memory because Hagia Sophia makes it impossible for us to forget, for each individual or community intertwined with this sacred place to just see its historical unfolding just as history. I understand his conceptualization as one of a fight between history and memory. Governments want to make history with the monument, yet it is the memorial aspect of it that hurts most and compels action. So there's a whole paper to be written about this, but I actually want to take these different moments of the transformation of Hagia Sophia and talk about each one of them with the caution that we shouldn't too strictly separate these historical periods, because each one really bled into the other, and because each one had precedents that actually created the other. So this is not these are not 3-4 different moments. They're actually historical unfoldings that have had an effect on the church, mosque, museum over time. Hagia Sophia was never static. It changed through the periods and accumulated layers of cultural capital as it changed. For the purposes of this conversation, I think we should focus on the transformation from the basilica to a mosque, then the museum, and then finally the recent transformation. And I wanted to look a little, if I have time, I'm not sure, what happened to at each period deeply, but also diachronically into periods in between. I want to make a simple argument. That is that each of the states, regimes that changed the status of Hagia Sophia appropriated it within the context of their understanding of their role in history, their particular political formation, and produced the narratives necessary for the integration of the monument into the popular culture. Here we have to distinguish between the imperial project of the Ottoman Empire, the emergent independent nationalist project of Atatürk, and again, finally, the increasing religious nationalism of modern Turkey, which has become a Sunni majoritarian and authoritarian project. In each of these time periods, there are significant ideologies and macro-historical cultural understandings embedded in political action and legitimacy. In each of these time periods, there is also the question of how the subjects of the empire or the citizens of the nation understood the significance of the transformation and the utilization and consumption of the monument. Such understandings are produced by meta-narratives, by discourses that tell the larger stories that convince people. So the Ottoman Empire, my favorite subject, let me talk about that a little bit, the conquest of Constantinople. I have spent many pages describing empire as a negotiated enterprise, as a political formation that has as its basic structure the possibility of flexible rule, multivocal statements and understandings, as well as an openness to diversity, if not for anything else but the basic inability to impose uniformity. The Ottomans became a state and an empire based on conquest of territory, but also based on the brokerage of ties across many different groups and extended networks. They were both conquerors and wily leaders who used the local context to devise policies of accommodation, not out of a notion of deep tolerance, but as a policy of toleration, as management of diversity. So we have to continuously think about this duality, this set of contradictory yet closely associated moves when we think about Hagia Sophia as well. Preparation for the Islamic status of this magnificent basilica that had captured the world's imagination were well known in the Muslim world. And I don't want to go into that, but Nancy Kalek, Gülru Necipoğlu, all of them talked about at length, and Hasluk obviously, but talked about at length about the ways in which the narratives, the stories that told, that constructed a previous history of the Hagia Sophia in connection with Islam, created this discourse that convinced, that was widely also disseminated, and convinced this of a continuity between empires and a continuity between Christian past and Islamic present. So the production of narratives before and after conquest, imperial predilections towards toleration of diversity, the multivocality of discourses on religion, and the particular meaning that Mehmet the Conqueror gave to his actions of conquest, conversion, and rebuilding, all make up for this moment of conversion. They're all part of the mix. It is an act of conquest, yet it is deliberately accommodated to the multiplicity of discourses and narratives of this time. So Hagia Sophia was transformed into a mosque, but as we know from the historical material, the church did not lose its Christian religious character for a long time. Mehmet II was enthralled by the image of Mary and Jesus and maintained it. We also know from the work of Julian Rabi how much Mehmet read and appreciated Roman Byzantine art and history. The beautiful miniatures and the imagery was not covered until the 17th or even the 18th century. But what is important is that we also know from travelers' reports that Christians continued to visit the church, that they were allowed access during some holy times into the 17th century. And in some ways, Hagia Sophia was during Ottoman times a shared sacred site for quite a long time. It played with multiplicity. It allowed it within its construction. The renovations and the covering of the miniatures started obviously with the reign of Ahmed I in the 17th century, but jumping, because I have to go fast, into the 19th century, when the repairs and the renovation was done under Abdülmecid, and there is the finding out that some of these beautiful miniatures were had been covered, and Abdülmecid was told about them. He actually, what he did was he showed respect. He said, they are beautiful, hide them, yet because our religion forbids them, hide them well, but do not destroy them, for who knows what can happen. So he is presaging, he is telling of a future. And let's not forget that this moment in Ottoman time is also a moment of the concept of museums starting, the moment of cultural heritage notions being appropriated from the West, demands for conservation of buildings happening. So a European and American discourse was also developing at this time. And there's this exchange about these issues, about this. So this is the beginning. Had we had a continuation of the Ottoman Empire and not the history and alternative thinking, it might have happened within an Ottoman, I'm being wild here, but within an Ottoman transformation, we might have had a transformation that made Hagia Sophia into a museum. I do not take that off the table. Now, the overthrow of the Ottomans, the second period, we have to turn our attention to a new national state, an emergent nationalism, very powerful nationalism, the construction of a national state with its policies of inclusion and exclusion. So who belongs, who doesn't belong is very important within that new context. Hagia Sophia, to whom does it belong? How do we define its place in a new political and cultural system? By the time Atatürk was making the decisions regarding secularization of religious sites, an American discourse had increased about Hagia Sophia had increased. New York Times articles referring to the mosque as a Christian site, calling it a great church, were all heated up. So was it a great church? Was it a great mosque? It was increasingly becoming an overloaded symbol for multiple constituencies, foreign and domestic. And I think that was really important to actually part of the decision-making here of Atatürk. And he's quoted as saying, it will be, that's not Atatürk. That's not the Atatürk that I have read in my textbooks in my childhood. It will be reasonable to convert Hagia Sophia into a museum. Atatürk would not have said, just to do a little textual analysis, it will be reasonable. which will be open to the visits of all nations and religions rather than letting it belong to a single religion and a single group. And it will be particularly appropriate to collect the Byzantine works in this museum. So whatever we think about that moment, it is a moment of secularization. It is a moment of deciding to make a gesture towards the West, but also it's the moment, remember, when actually Venizelos and Atatürk are getting closer, and he's proposing Atatürk for a Nobel Peace Prize. So let's think about all of that. But what I want to really say is about this time period is that actually it was the moment where Islamic opposition to this transformation happened. But the great failure of the early Republican state was to go on, and I will finish in 2 minutes. I won't do the third, but I need to say that. To go on and not produce the narratives that included the Hagia Sophia into the larger context. So people were left in modern Turkey, various constituencies were left on their own to understand this building. So minorities, educated middle classes continued the tradition of shared sacred sites and went there and used it partially as a sacred site and thought about it that way. Tourists thought about it as a museum, and Muslims thought about it as a major problem in their historical understanding. Am I supposed to stop?
Sorry, I had to unmute. If you have a few more minutes, that's fine.
Okay, so let me just finish by saying the third moment of the transformation, the current moment of the transformation is very different. It is a moment that has taken a very long time to prepare, and where actually the intense work of the popular media, TV, historical dramas, acting to retell a history of the Ottomans as conquerors of glorious Muslim empire created an effective unity among the majority of religious Turkish citizens. So it did the transformation that I don't have time to explain all of that, but the transformation of the third period, again, is a long transformation, and it has built the appropriate narratives for this moment. So in a sense, it's acceptance by a large public of Turks, religious Turks, is expected, and the nationalist as well as the religious, because this is a moment that has been worked at for a very long time. I won't have time to continue, but that's what I wanted to actually distinguish between. Thank you. Sorry for a longer talk.
Thank you so much, Karen. You know, if time were not a scarce resource, I'm sure that we would benefit from listening to you and to our other participants all day long. But for the sake of our conversation, we'll move on now. Though I do want to particularly punctuate this interesting point about, you know, the speculation of the sort of history that might have been the Ottoman Empire, might have changed it into a museum. Whatever that might have looked like, it certainly wouldn't look like Neo-Ottomanism as it exists today. I think we can probably agree. So with that brief editorial comment, I'll now turn to Axel Corlu and ask you, Axel, to turn your microphone on here. Axel Corlu is a scholar with over 2 decades of experience in academia. His research fields include Byzantine and Ottoman history, food history, military history, political violence and terrorism, and the modern Middle East, among others. I'm already getting both hungry and frightened reading this. Over the years, he has taught courses in history and sociology at 4 universities in the United States. His published work in English and Turkish has appeared in various academic and popular venues, and he continues his participation in numerous conferences around the world. A native speaker of Greek, Italian, and Turkish, Dr. Corlu holds degrees in history, intelligence studies, sociology, and political science. So please, Axel, we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Jeremy. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here and part of the conversation. Can you all hear me well? Is my voice picking up fine? Okay, good. So given that we have relatively limited time, there is only so much that we can do with the scope of the subject and only so much we can do as far as depth. I do have a bunch of visuals for you to guide along this conversation. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Let's see. Here it is. And okay. Let's see. All right. So I've titled this presentation, Heritage and Identity via Conquest, the Hagia Sophia and Multiple Challenges Facing Scholars and the Public in Processing Its Role. I'm going to go back a little bit further than most scholars who think about the Hagia Sophia in its present form and the discussions that are centered in its present situation, and go all the way back to Justinian's time when it was built. Very, very quickly, not in depth, obviously. But one thing I want to establish here is that the Hagia Sophia, from its very beginning, was not meant to be just one thing. It was not just meant to be one building and that's it. So the obvious purpose of the building, you know, it's built as a church. It's, you know, it's the seat of the patriarch. So, you know, that part is clear. But when you look at Constantinople in Justinian's time, in which context it was built, right after the Nika revolt that was very destructive, you can see that it was also a very powerful statement of empire. When I teach my Byzantine classes, I always use the metaphor for my students to visualize the Hagia Sophia as not just a church, but also a sort of a mailed imperial fist that shows the world the might and the sophistication of the Roman or Byzantine Empire right there. There are other aspects to this, but this is an important aspect that we should carry with us as we move along in this journey. And the picture that I just showed, sorry, I forgot to mention this. The picture I showed was an illustration. I forget, it's a French illustrator. I can find the information later if anyone's interested, of Constantinople, slightly after Justinian's time, I believe, looking at the buildings. And the next one is also by the same illustrator. It shows a sort of cut off or a cutaway slice of Hagia Sophia during this time. So this imperial message that we're talking about carries over into Ottoman times very, very well. When we think about messages, when we think about symbolisms, I get a bit bothered when much of the discussion centers on religion and religious significance. So, because that usually, not always, but usually leads to ideas or binary positions about, is it a church, is it a mosque, is it this, is it that? And these binary positions are not really fruitful. They are not good for analysis. They are not good for our understanding of structure. So that brings us to the Ottomans. I've just chosen a relatively generic photo of Hagia Sophia here, nothing particularly interesting perhaps, but let's think about how the Ottomans understood this. How did they think of the Hagia Sophia? And how did they think of themselves in this world that where they were conquerors and they were building something? Now, if you listen to the republics, Turkish republics version of history, or for that matter, the so-called Neo-Ottoman version of history, you get a very different picture. But the reality is the Ottomans very much saw themselves as the continuation of the Byzantines. Of course, there were new elements, new aspects, you know, there's no doubt about that. But nonetheless, let's not forget that they coexisted for a few centuries with the Byzantines. The Byzantines were the dominant empire and civilization on those lands with all its ideas, structures, and so on that the Ottomans came to and basically absorbed culture, you know, state formation, even down to military issues and so on. There are so many similarities, so many things that they absorbed from the Byzantines. So it's no wonder then that the Ottomans saw themselves as a continuation of the Byzantines. regardless of what the outside world thought of them. That's how they thought of themselves. Now, as such, the Hagia Sophia then is inevitably going to be the center of this sort of worldview. It is, after all, the most magnificent monumental building in the new capital of the empire. And there are other monumental buildings, let's not forget, but they don't have quite the same significance. So you can think of the Hippodrome, for example, which was partially in ruins by the time they conquered it. They didn't really pay a lot of attention to the Hippodrome. There are buildings such as the Church of the Holy Apostles, where the emperors were typically buried. And that was replaced by the Fatih Mosque, which is still there today. So there are different approaches to different monumental buildings, not just a single approach. But in the case of the Hagia Sophia, as my colleague before me mentioned, they didn't take it as merely a sign of conquest. There was continuity in its use as well. Now, obviously not as a church, but the imagery was not covered up, as was already mentioned, and so on. So the way that the Ottomans position themselves and how they reveal what they think of the world and their place in it through this building is not what the so-called neo-Ottomans or neo-Ottomanists think or want us to think. There's a difference there. Now we come to, and I'm moving rapidly, obviously, for obvious reasons, to the third sort of transformation, Republican transformation. And here we have a whole bunch of issues where I'd like to spend some time with. The first one is something I see all the time, that the new republic, the Turkish Republic, used this space as an elegant compromise. I see this phrasing quite often. And it's almost presented as if this was some kind of multiculturalist approach, or an approach of tolerance, or whatever, these kinds of concepts. And I want to argue that it had nothing to do with that. It had much to do with how the Republic separated itself from the Ottoman Empire, how it chose certain aspects of that past, and how it recreated a past for itself. It was creating a space for itself. So what I wrote here, just to quickly go over that, is that the Republic utilized the Hagia Sophia for concrete ideological purposes. The museumification was not about preservation or conservation or finding a compromise, let alone multiculturalism. It was an ideological tool representing and reinforcing the building blocks of the Republic. Yes, it was a message to the West, as also was mentioned, but it was also a message internally, domestically, to different groups. If you think about the constituent groups of the Republic and what it wanted to create out of them, first of all, it was a message to the urban middle class, the elites that the Republic was very much focused on. And it showed their mastery over the past. Here is something that we have received from the past, and here we are changing it into something modern and new, and so on and so forth. It went along with those ideas. It was also a message to the periphery, basically anywhere outside of Istanbul, more or less. Well, Ankara as well, of course. But the people in the periphery were not always on the same page with what the Republic wanted to be. And there's a lot of history of conflict there. And part of this was that when you look at the Hagia Sophia as a museum rather than a mosque, it shows the muscle of the Republic, basically telling the people in the periphery, if you had any ideas that this would be just a continuation of the past, where you can express your idea of whatever your religion is, forget about it. We are now defining what your religion will be. We are defining this secular space, the religious space. We are establishing, in fact, organizations to regulate your religion. So the Hagia Sophia fits into that picture. At the same time, if you look at the remaining minorities in those lands, well, there weren't that, the numbers were not as great, of course, compared to the late Ottoman period, but nonetheless, they were there. And how the Republic treated its minorities, you see a lot of conflict there as well. And maybe conflict is not even the right word, because the minorities were in no real position to offer any resistance. So conflict requires some resistance. But what happened to the minorities during the Republic's first few decades also suggests that the presence of Hagia Sophia can also be seen from this perspective, from the perspective of the minorities, that it is also a symbol of dispossession and eventually cultural appropriation, which brings me to this particular, these two pictures, just to define or describe what these are. On the left, I have a nude art photo from the 1970s. It was a session that was done in the 1970s. There are many other pictures like this, or photographs like this. I chose the most striking one. And to the right, of course, you have the director of religious affairs holding, well, let's say holding that sword. There are some problems with his handling of that sword, but we'll come to that in a moment. There's a reason I put these two things together. So in the Republican period, this idea of conquest of the past and the creation of something new meant that anything that was seen as a threat to that would have been of immediate concern. So for example, if you wanted to hold an Orthodox Mass in the Hagia Sophia, just once, you know, keep its status as a museum, but maybe have a symbolic thing there, right? That would have been unthinkable. It would have been seen as, you know, a sort of a creation of the Byzantine past, perhaps, you know, some kind of imaginary past catching up to the present. That could not be allowed and so on. But it was perfectly fine to have nude photos taken in the Hagia Sophia because, of course, this was modern. This was something that did not threaten the regime in the way that it thought of itself. Now, to the right, as I said, we see a different use for the Hagia Sophia. It's really a trophy that has multiple uses. And in this case, you see the green banners hanging above him. You see the sword, all of which are symbols of conquest. But what kind of conquest are we talking about? And who processes this definition of conquest is not always very clear. So the second collage that I have here is also two pictures. On the left, I have what appears to be a modern dancer performing. And on the right, I have something that was circulated widely in social media after the reconversion of the Hagia Sophia, a rather, let's say, corpulent individual lying and taking a selfie on the carpet. So this thing was, this sort of juxtaposition is not my idea. It was shared widely on social media, and it was shared mostly by people who thought of almost like a lost cause. I'm borrowing this term from US history, which is where it's typically used for the Confederate States of America, where the idea was that the Confederate States were these, it was a just cause, that it was not a bad or event in history, that they were misunderstood, and it's a lost cause because of that, as a result of the Civil War. Here, the lost cause, from a perhaps secular perspective, obviously, is that we had something wonderful, you know, golden age thinking, the Republic and its secular institutions, and then these Islamists came about, and look what happened. We used to have modern art in there, and now we have this fellow individual taking a picture of himself on the floor. That's the image, that's the sort of way that it's being processed. These dichotomies, these sort of, as I already said, these binary types of thinking are not really useful for us, but it's useful for us to understand why people think in such binary terms. Moving on, let's talk about conquest. Is it the same conquest for everyone? And the answer, of course, is it's not. I already talked about the Ottoman formulation of conquest a little bit, and the Republican version was basically a conquest of the past. Let's talk about Neo-Ottomanism. And I say so-called Neo-Ottomanism because, like many other colleagues in the field, I'm bothered by the association of Ottomans into this Neo-Ottomanism, as if it's like a continuation of the Ottoman Empire, the ideas of the Ottoman Empire. Whereas in reality, it's a very highly selective bunch of themes that are brought together for an agenda in our time, in recent times. But also, as mentioned, it was quite a while in the making. It didn't just come about, you know, in one day, in 1 year, in 10 years. It's decades in the making as well. And when we trace it, we can see that it merges, ironically perhaps, some Republican themes. I mean, it's partially a result of the Republic. The education system and the mythology of the Republic is partially absorbed in this Neo-Ottomanism, as well as other 19th century formulations that the Republic did not quite choose, but were still there, nationhood and religion and so on, that were not quite adopted in the same way. And uses, you know, symbology based on the 16 Turkish states in history, or a Turkish state tradition going back 3,000 years and so on. And these, of course, are from the Republican period. You know, they are not things that the Neo-Ottomanists invented themselves. We don't have the time to get into any of them right now, but the whole 16 Turkish states idea, for example, is a fantasy. Any historian will tell you that. Most of them, it's doubtful that they were actually states as we understand them. Um, and of course, talking about a Turkish state tradition going back 3,000 years is ahistorical, to put it mildly. Now, the utilization of Golden Age thinking, which really mixes these sort of various strains of nostalgia into this imaginary sort of concoction, it's very successful. It captures the imagination of the public by and large. It's also useful to legitimize certain acts, both domestic policies and foreign policies for the current administration. So it really is the perfect storm in that sense. So when we think about the conquest narrative, there is a conquest narrative that goes all the way back to the Ottomans, sure. But the contents of that narrative are not quite the same. That changes. It's just that the idea of conquest remains important for different reasons. Moving on, from conquest to endless conquest, how the conquest narrative prevents Turkish people from a true engagement with their heritage. This is an idea I've been developing for a while. Oh, go ahead, Jeremy.
Sorry, Axel. I'm only for the interest of time, I'll ask just 1 or 2 more minutes, if that's okay.
Yep, that's exactly what I have. These are the last 2 slides. So this conquest narrative prevents Turkish people from a two-way engagement with their heritage, because the idea, and what you're looking at are pictures of the Kora Museum or Cartier Mosque right now, before and after its conversion, and how you can see how various frescoes and so on were covered. Now, there is this sort of Central Asian mythos that was promoted by all kinds of people going all the way back to the late 19th century, certainly promoted by the Republic, and still to this day is a powerful idea. And that is, a lot of Turkish people today still think that they are descendants of Central Asian people, that the actual people who were there at the time of the conquest have magically disappeared, and their ancestors carved up this space for them to exist. If you approach the world and the land and the heritage that you live on with this mindset, what you're going to get is an inability to absorb the heritage as your own, because you are constantly conquering it. And that's where the idea of endless conquest comes from. You have to keep conquering it. It is the other, the other that you saw in popular culture, where Cüneyt Arkın in those Turkish films was destroying the Byzantine princes and so on and so forth. So the idea that you are not really part of the land, but the conqueror of the land, and have no connection to whatever was there before the arrival of the Selçuks, is a poisonous idea. It's a toxic idea. It prevents your absorption of a larger history and connection to that history. And finally, and this is my last statement, scholars are not immune to this bias or propaganda or skewed perceptions of history either. Even the best among us unconsciously absorb these kinds of things. Think about a scholar of the Ottoman Empire, for example, studying the Ottoman Empire, you go to Turkey, you go to archives. At some point in your mind, you create an image of what it must have been like during Ottoman times. And as you create that image, intellectually you're aware that there must have been many other people, but you're also taking a lot from the current day, from the present, where most people speak Turkish. It's a much more homogenous society than it used to be. It's still not homogenous, but much more so. So those images that are feeding your imagination, perhaps at an unconscious level, also feed from these kinds of messages. And filtering them is not always very easy. It requires a lot of self-thought, self-criticism, and so on and so forth. So in the interest of time, I will stop now. Thank you, everyone. And I will stop sharing my screen. Let's see. Am I back?
Yes, thank you so much, Axel.
Thank you.
Your slide from the 1970s brings to mind also the more recent travails of, I believe it's the Belgian model, Marissa Papan, who I think has been charged for posing nude in and then also near or sort of with Hagia Sophia in the background. I'm also reminded of the concept of internal irredentism. I can't remember, is it Boro who introduces that? Anyhow, I'll turn the microphone now over to Emily Neumeier, who I'm happy to introduce, a longtime associate and inspiration for our group. She is assistant professor of art history at Temple University. Her research concerns the art and architecture of the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly of the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. Before coming to Temple, Neumeier was a research collaborator in the Max Planck group Objects in the Contact Zone, the Cross-Cultural Lives of Thing, which was a great group at the Kunsthistorische Institute in Florence. During the 2018 and 2019 academic year, she was in residence at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens as a Getty American Council of Learned Societies Fellow in the History of Arts. And thank you for joining us again, Emily.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy, for having me. So I'll just start off by saying that, as Jeremy mentioned, I'm a historian of art and architecture, and it's in this capacity in the next few minutes that I'd like to touch on some concerns raised by the current situation in terms of preservation and cultural heritage management, and how we can look to the longer history of the building to imagine possibilities for the future, which is something we've already been talking about a little bit, so I hope to build on what's already been said. All right. So let me say a few words about my own research and how I came to this topic. So I'm a historian of Islamic art and architecture with a focus on the architecture of the Ottoman Empire. And back in 2018, I organized a symposium with my Byzantinist colleague, Benjamin Anderson, about Hagia Sophia in the long 19th century. Surprisingly, what happened to this building in the modern period, and I consider the 19th century the modern period, remains relatively understudied. So we set about bringing a group of historians together to talk about different ways various actors engaged with the building during this period, from local communities of Greek-speaking Christians living in Istanbul to the Ottoman state officials who launched a major restoration campaign in the mid-19th century, which has already been touched on by Dr. Barkey. So, here we are minding our own business, working on this project about Hagia Sophia, and we're actually now turning these, the output of this symposium into a book. And then July 10th happens. Turkish, as we all know, Turkish courts declare that the conversion of Hagia Sophia into a museum in the 1930s to be unlawful. And then President Erdogan issues a decree that the site will once again become a mosque. So in anticipation of the official ruling in July, my colleague Ben and I felt like we needed to get organized and build some consensus among Byzantine and Ottoman historians, i.e. the people who are experts on this building, about our stance on the current situation. Along with a few other colleagues, we wrote and published on Medium an open letter about the status of Hagia Sophia. It is available in 4 languages: English, Turkish, Greek, and French. And in the first week was viewed about 15,000 times and collected almost 400 signatures. And I know that 400 signatures doesn't really sound like a lot, but the fact that all signatories have PhDs in Byzantine or Ottoman studies, in my opinion, the fact that we got that many Byzantinists and Ottomanists to come together and agree on something contentious like Hagia Sophia is nothing short of miraculous. So let me give you some of the highlights of the concerns that we raised specifically about issues of preservation and management of the monument. Most importantly, we pointed out that the debate over the status of the building, should Hagia Sophia be a museum or a mosque, was ultimately a distraction from the more pressing question, which is how can we best care for Hagia Sophia? In other words, if we do not properly look after the building now and preserve it for future generations, then there is really not much point in arguing about what kinds of activities are taking place inside. Of course, I don't want to dismiss how charged and important this question of status is for the various stakeholders, but I think this even further underlines how important it is to have a solid management strategy in place for the building. Just to be clear, I'd like to say that the #1 question for art historians about the conversion of the building back into a mosque is what will be done with the Byzantine mosaics. Over the centuries, as both a church and a mosque, Hagia Sophia has become a vast repository for spectacular works of art, including this mosaic of the Virgin Mary and Jesus found in the apse that I'm showing you here, as well as massive medallions of Islamic calligraphy bearing the names of revered figures within Islam. And I'm showing you an example of a medallion showing the name of Ali that hangs within the space currently. So as most of you know, the main issue is that typically mosques do not include any representations of human figures out of concern that they may encourage false devotion and take away from the worship of God. The majority of the Byzantine mosaics that can be seen in the building today were uncovered in the 1930s when Hagia Sophia was converted into a museum in the early years of the Turkish Republic, which means that the mosaics were covered up at some point in the Ottoman period, but the timeline for that is worth looking into, as I'll discuss in a moment, and as Dr. Barkey already pointed out. So having said all that, in terms of conservation, a primary concern is that the change in function or status of the building seems to correspond with a change in the administration. While the Hagia Sophia Museum was managed by the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, the conversion of the building back into a mosque transfers control to the Diyanet, the Directorate General of Pious Foundations. In recent years, the Directorate General has assumed control of other Byzantine monuments and reopened them to Muslim worship. One prominent example is another Hagia Sophia, this one in Trabzon on the Black Sea, whose proper administration has been contested since 2013. An effort to reopen the building to Muslim prayer included construction of an elaborate set of screens to obscure the Byzantine wall paintings. And of course, the inclusion of a beautiful plywood minbar and mihrab, which is part of the necessary furniture to use the space as a mosque. This restoration was done with very little transparency, and we do not know how these changes were done. For example, the apparatus holding up the screen that's fixed to the structure to cover the mosaics, do they have to drill into the walls to put that in? We don't know. What about the electric wiring for the lighting here? Also not clear. None of this was sort of made public or published in as public information. It should also be pointed out that the ruling AK Party has a very concerning track record in terms of their approach to restoration and urban development projects, especially in Istanbul. The 2013 Gezi Park protests were notably sparked by the Taksim redevelopment project, which included the reincarnation of the long-gone 19th century Ottoman barracks, Topkapı, in the form of a large shopping mall. The clear mobilization of Ottoman architectural heritage and a monument that specifically emphasizes imperial military strength as a vehicle for the current government's neoliberal politics was not lost on many critics. After overwhelming protests and civil unrest, the Taksim Barracks project seems to have finally been abandoned. The prevalent discourse on cultural heritage management in Istanbul largely falls between two camps. Those who prioritize the preservation of historic fabric to the greatest extent possible, and those who perceive preservation as a real hindrance to progress. The divide between these two approaches distinctly emerges when one parses the language of the slew of documents that accompany development legislation and project proposals. So the term restoration, restauration, usually signals the conservation of historic fabric as a priority in the project, while the term renewal, yenileme or yenileşmek, tends to describe the complete or partial demolition and replication of a historic structure. Both words promise the protection of cultural heritage, but the results on the ground look very different indeed. Okay, so only 2 weeks after Erdogan's presidential decree, Hagia Sophia was outfitted for the first Friday prayers in the building, a ceremony that officially converted the site into a mosque. And I want to stress that this is a very short amount of time to make physical changes to the building. Usually these kinds of plans take months or even years to form because you need to consult with conservationists and run impact studies to understand the potential long-term consequences of these kinds of major interventions. And as you can, let me see here, as you can see from this photograph, which is an interior shot of the apse of Hagia Sophia outfitted for the July 24th reconversion prayers, the major changes to the structure for these opening prayers included laying down green carpet on the marble floor and shielding the mosaic of the Virgin Mary in the apse with sail-like coverings. I've also seen reports on Twitter about the famous mosaic of Constantine and Justinian being covered by this like hanging screen. The concerns that I outlined for Trabzon also apply here. Is the carpet resistant to fire and moisture? How are the coverings attached to the walls? Are they fireproof? We don't know. We have no idea. And given the ruling party's broader leaning more to renewal than restoration, I also start to wonder more generally about what this could mean in the future for the complex. Not to be, you know, glib about it, but when is the motto going to be built in the garden area, for example? You know, frankly, when that scaffolding with the Turkcell advertisements go up, you never know exactly what will appear when they finally come down. And I think all of us who have spent a lot of time in Istanbul understand that. In his presidential decree, Erdogan said, after a gap of 86 years, Hagia Sophia will serve its purpose again as laid out in the pious foundations of Mehmed the Conqueror. So sorry, this is actually, this is another quote from the Hutbah. The reopening of Hagia Sophia for worship is the attainment of the fundamental character, asla vasfa, of the holy place that welcomed the faithful for 5 centuries. So this was the Hutbah, and then, you know, in President Erdogan's decree, both of these statements, the president and the imam, are clearly calling for return of the monument to its past as a symbol of Ottoman conquest, with which Dr. Corlu has already touched on. And yet, we've already discussed this a little bit. You know, also I'll state this briefly. We know that the Ottoman attitudes toward the Byzantine decorations in the building, most crucially the figural mosaics, changed over time. The mosaic of the Virgin Mary in the apse was still visible in the 18th century. And, you know, what's more, we know the faces of the seraphim under the central dome of Hagia Sophia were only covered up during restorations during the 19th century. So they were visible in the main prayer hall for a solid 4 centuries while Hagia Sophia functioned as a mosque. And as Dr. Barkey already mentioned, it was also during the mid-19th century restorations that the first time architects uncovered and documented the Byzantine mosaics. And this activity was ordered by Abdülmecid. So I believe that this 19th century moment is actually very interesting when the Ottoman elites began to consider this as a potential shared sacred space, a place that could simultaneously be a site of active religious worship, as well as a museum preserving the layered past of this monument. To conclude, given the long, complex history of the building as a mosque, this all raises the question of what version of the Ottoman past is being activated here in the 21st century. And no matter the status or function of the building, how do we continue to advocate for a management strategy commensurate to the scale of the challenges, which includes the preservation of the historical fabric and continued visibility of the works of art of all periods, Byzantine and Ottoman, responsible management of mass tourism, and protection against the threat of earthquake. Successive Byzantine, Ottoman, and Turkish governments have protected Hagia Sophia against the ravages of time, and thus maintained its significance not only for themselves, but also for those to come in the future, including all of us. It is a matter of vital concern that the current Turkish government continue this tradition of responsible stewardship. And I believe that if we look at earlier moments, like in the mid-19th century Ottoman restorations, when the building became a mosque and a heritage monument, we could imagine bold and creative solutions for the future. For example, a museum that accommodates both Christian and Islamic prayer. There are precedents for this kind of arrangement. I mean, just off the top of my head, Westminster Abbey. I think the Rotunda in Thessaloniki is an interesting counterexample. And even though this vision for Hagia Sophia seems like a pipe dream, if there's anything I've learned from 2020, it's that nothing is impossible. We just have to make sure we keep the building up in the meantime. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emily, for so nicely integrating our concerns into the spirit of the moment as well. I think, at least for me, and I'm reminded of this listening to you, one of the great, again, perhaps silver linings of the recent politicization of Hagia Sophia has been a new sense of camaraderie and collaboration across disciplines, and especially across the Ottomanist, Byzantinist divide, which remains all too cemented in discussions of Hagia Sophia and indeed of both empires. And that's a nice segue into our next speaker's introduction as well, I think. Bissera Pentcheva will join us now. And so I'll ask you, Bissera, to turn on your microphone. Bissera is a professor of art and art history at Stanford University. Her innovative work in acoustics, art, and music has redefined the field of Byzantine architecture. She has published 3 books with Pennsylvania State University Press, of which Hagia Sophia, Sound, Space, and Spirit in Byzantium is of great relevance to our discussion today, indeed. And that's actually a better image than the one that I showed earlier of light pouring in through the apse and the windows there, and the dome as well, of course. The book received the prestigious 2018 American Academy of Religions Award in Excellence in Historical Studies, and Pentcheva's research on Hagia Sophia has been featured on NPR and in the New York Times this past year, and I definitely recommend that all of you look up that New York Times article in particular. It's a nice introduction in general. Bissera, thank you for joining us.
Jeremy, thank you for the invitation. Do you hear me well? Very well. My intention today is to show the intangible aspects of Hagia Sophia that make this space transcendent, something that asks you to leave the everyday reality as you step in this space. And it is connected with both light and sound, things that you cannot hold, but things that envelop you. The building has one of the largest domed interiors. It was for a long time the largest one in the Mediterranean, and its system of lighting and the resultant also reverberant acoustics was something that was unprecedented and never really copied in the scale that was manifested in Constantinople. So my focus is the Justinianic Church, and I will look at Byzantine ritual. And my intention today is to allow you to experience some of these moments of enveloping sound. So I will start first with the building itself, its marble revetments, its large interior volume, and its light. So what I'm showing you is on the left, it's an image from Erich Lessing from the late 60s, early 70s that shows light trickling in the interior. It's a morning light, probably around 10 o'clock in the morning. And I would assume it is actually spring that we are looking at. Then at the far right, you have an interior that is approximately a couple of days before the winter solstice, with the sun rays that come directly from the central window of the apse. We know the building was designed for the winter solstice, which means that this sense of alignment, that the moment you stay at the central gates, the imperial gates, and you look directly towards the apse, everything aligns in the vertical axis as the sun rises in that space. Since the building was inaugurated approximately around Christmas time, it is all very significant that the new light, the incarnation of Christ, the birth of Christ, all coincide as a plastic aesthetic experience. It acquires a plastic form, that sunlight resurrects, in a sense, the life in this building with the winter solstice and the sun coming directly from the east side. Now, we can discuss probably in the Q&A session how the conversion of this building in 1453 into a mosque manipulated this axis and shifted the axis further to the south in order for the mihrab to align with Mecca. And that creates a sense of disorientation when you step into the building, because certain things are off axis. The focus of attention is off axis if one focuses on the mihrab and the minbar. And that is significant because there is an original aesthetic of this building that is aligned with the sunlight, and that is and it is working as a complete Gesamtkunstwerk in the building itself. And it is compromised as the building is adapted for another religion and another function. And so the aesthetic is compromised as the building is converted into a mosque. The other, what else I'm showing you in this image is some of the liturgical furnishings that has not survived, and my focus will be on the ambo. So the ambo would have been a structure directly under the rim of the eastern dome, and this is the place where both the higher clergy will officiate the liturgy, but it's also the place where the elite choir, which consists of 25 people, but only 12 with the soloist, so 13, perform on a given 2-weekly occasion. So this is important to know, that there is an elite choir that is responsible for filling this interior with sound. And when they perform, they climb up the stairs of the ambo, as you see in the miniature, the 11th century miniature, and as you see here, the staircase as well. When they do not perform, they are under the ambo, waiting in a sense under the platform. So what does it mean? It means that when the interior is filled with people, with 16,000 people as what this interior could hold, the singers, the ones that recite and sing, are raised above human height in order to project their voices. And they do not sing from the apse. The apse itself is actually acoustically compromised space. So there's something to think about the Islamic ritual in that space, that the voice, in a sense, is significantly compromised if it comes directly from the mihrab. It doesn't have the best acoustics. What the ambu does in terms of its acoustics, it activates the power of the dome. And as the singers are above human height, they don't have any obstruction, which means that some of the acoustic energy will be absorbed by the people. There are no reflections from the floor when the building is filled, and all their voices are projected upward to activate the acoustics of the dome. So a building that has a huge interior volume, over 250,000 cubic meters, and reflective surfaces of marble revetments that you see here, results in extremely reverberant acoustics. So what I'm showing you here, it's a series of images. The floor, the marble floor, it comes from Proconnesus, this island 118 kilometers off the shore from Constantinople in this stone is gray with veins. It's actually white with gray veins. And the particular way in which the marble is placed here, it is called book matching, when the blocks are sliced and opened. And as they open, they create this undulating pattern of sea waves. Marble with this understanding in the ancient and medieval world as congealed water lends itself to this architectural mythical imagination of water. So the floor of Hagia Sophia is it's the primordial ocean on which the spirit descends, and it causes this marble to become the glitter of the waves, therefore performing the theatrical, the drama aspect of living waters. Now, and this I say because so far we've discussed how important the mosaics are in Hagia Sophia, but the Justinianic interior was unprecedented by not using monumental figural decoration. What we see today as the images of the Virgin and Christ in the apse, these are images that were placed there after iconoclasm, after 843, in the year 867. And it is significant that Byzantium developed the concept of image that is actually very close to Islam, that it's performance, it is breath that is voiced through the human body. And that building was this megaphone that played out this notion of cosmic power that rests in the voice and in the light. And both are associated with the notion of marmarigma and lampros. Marmarigma, marble comes from the marmar. It is the quiver of the water, and it's the glitter of the water which makes these living waters, which the spirit animates, the way the spirit animates the primordial ocean in Genesis. And this is related to brightness, that the sound in Hagia Sophia, and I'm going to move here to the next image, is of extreme, that you have a very long reverberation time of low frequencies and very long reverberation time of high frequencies. What you see at the bottom of my image is the spectrum of reverberation time of different frequencies. So within the range of the singing voice, let's say from around 100 hertz to several kilohertz, the reverberation time is approximately 12 seconds, which means, and so what is reverberation time? To briefly explain, this is the residual energy after the voice has produced a note, after a signal has been fired in the space. How long does it take for that signal to reduce below 30 dB, the level of human hearing? That period is 12 seconds. This building is unprecedented when we compare it to our contemporary experience or habit of listening to music, listening to performances. Most of our concert halls have reverberation time between 2 to 4 seconds when they're empty. This building has 12 seconds when it's empty, and that's significant, which means that this building transforms information into prosody, into the taste of sound. And that is significant, that we have a building that goes against our understanding of knowledge as information that is encoded and decoded, encoded by the speaker and decoded by the listener. In Hagia Sophia, a lecture like the one today will be a soup of sound, and that's significant. And since Byzantium is already working with this phenomenon, and I'll come here, it is significant that some of its chants are actually pushing forward and further this notion of stretching the semantic chains. I'll come to this image in a second, but I want to show you what you're looking at. So this is a transcription of a Byzantine chant. And what we are looking here, it starts with, Lord bless your people, sosun Kyrie ton loon su, ke evlogisen ton klironomia su. So save people, oh Christ, oh Lord, save your people. That's the beginning. And as you look here, Kyrie becomes stretched with non-semantic syllables. And what you see here is ki, u, I, hi, ri, e. In other words, Kyrie acquires these extra syllables that extend the sound and the time of that word in the space, but they obfuscate the semantics of that word. So you have a continuous paradox and contradiction between drawing attention because the word is longer, it sounds longer in the space, and obfuscating its meaning. And in addition to that, so this is the first example, is the concatenation or the interlacing of these non-semantic syllables. And the second is melisma. This is the stretching that many notes are sung to a syllable. And you can see it here, for instance, in evlogisen. The law of evlogisen becomes this stretch of over 20 notes in which it sounds in the space. And it's not just a stretch, but it's also a jump of a fourth, which means that it goes from a low to a high note, which means that it will attack the acoustics of the dome. Why am I saying all this? Because Byzantine chant, the cathedral chant, shows an active manipulation of the reverberant acoustics of the space. It plays with it and enhances it, amplifies it. In other words, it works with the notion that once you start singing in that space, human voice transforms into the metaphysical. It becomes the voice of the divine. And this is probably a good point, and I'll play just this piece for you, and you can hear, and maybe I should explain a little bit of what this, no, I'll first play it for you, and then I'll explain how this research was brought together. I'll stop it here. This music you can listen on Spotify. It is part of our collaboration, Capella Romana and Icons of Sound, the project that is run by my department, Art History. I'm one of the co-directors, and my colleague Jonathan Abo in the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics. This is over a decade of collaborative work that we have produced. And what we have done is I have gone to Istanbul, to Hagia Sophia, to collect impulse response, to collect acoustic data from which Jonathan Abel had extracted the impulse response of the place, and we have been able to imprint it. Now, why? Several things that I would like to say with that. The way we worked were already within the limits of what Atatürk's legacy in Hagia Sophia as a museum had left. In other words, we cannot, the building is there. Its floors and walls have survived. Its interior volume has survived, but we cannot bring a choir. No one could sing in that space. At least no one could sing according to the status forbidding any performance of the human voice or instruments in that space when we started in 2008, and I collected the data in 2010. That had dramatically changed already in March of 2020. There was a several singers sang surahs of the Quran in that space while still a museum. So in other words, going against the ban. Now, we had to use ingenuity of how to obtain acoustic data from that space that will allow us to build an acoustic signature that we could imprint on first recorded sound and then live performance. And that's what the 10 years of our research really had done. But why am I saying all of this? Is because all of a sudden Byzantium, from the books, from understanding that empire based on the text and the monuments that has survived, became a Byzantium, and I'm speaking also as an experience as a scholar, became a Byzantium of experience that you could hear the surround sound of Hagia Sophia. These jumps of a fourth, which go to the high frequencies, they attack the acoustics of the dome, and what they produce is acoustic rain. It's a golden rain, all this gold mosaic in the dome, which did not have the image of Christ at the time of Justinian, but the cross and the rest of what you still see today, Justinianic mosaic there. It is golden rain that rains on the congregation below. And in other words, power becomes phenomenology, it becomes experience. It's about this resonant, wet sound that envelops the faithful in the space and transforms power. In this particular case is divine power, blessing, may you bless, is what is activated in the acoustics of the dome, starts to rain on the congregation below. The imperial institution was very savvy in the way they used the acoustics of the dome, and they placed the elite singers at the drum of the dome to sing directly, to project their voices directly into the dome, which makes the shorter the distances of this high frequency, short wavelengths of the bright sound, as it gathers in the dome and then reflects and rains down on the population. So in other words, Hagia Sophia was an instrument to perform power. And once you entered that space and you could hear the acclamations of the emperor was bathed in golden light and golden sound that enveloped everyone in the space. So I think this is a good moment for me to stop. I'll be very happy to address any questions. And what the main idea that I presented today is that the floors matter, the walls matter. Hagia Sophia is a space that is about water. Istanbul, Constantinople, is the city of water. To destroy this aesthetic, in a sense, to arrive from the Bosphorus that is reflected on the floors of Hagia Sophia, to the bazaar aesthetic of carpets, or the green carpet in the central space, or to focus attention on the 19th century shields bearing the names of the prophet and his closest associates, and treating the rest of the space like a tent or a starry night, is really losing track of this amazing structure, a credit to human creativity that has been built in the 6th century and has survived all the way to our times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bissera, for this resonant presentation, both metaphorically and literally. I think it's wonderful to listen to the recording as well, and I'm sure that you'll get many hits on Spotify in the coming days, I hope, in any event. It also calls to mind the sort of poverty of what we usually think of when we talk about intangible heritage. There isn't that sort of, typically that phenomenological dimension is lost, but with your work, it's so viscerally present. So thank you for that. We are running a little bit behind schedule, but I hope that all of us, or at least most of us, will be able to maintain our concentration for our final presentation and then participate in the question and answer session. And with that, I'd like to introduce our final discussant. It's a great pleasure, as I've been reading his work for so many years, almost 20 years, I think, at this point, to actually be able to invite him to speak at one of our events. Hakan Yavuz is professor of political science at the University of Utah. His current projects are focus on transnational Islamic networks in Central Asia and Turkey, the role of Islam in state building and nationalism, ethnic cleansing and genocide, and ethno-religious conflict management. Yavuz received his Master's of Arts from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in political science in 1998. He has thus far published 5 books: Nostalgia for the Empire, The Politics of Neo-Ottomanism, which is the most recent and quite timely, of course, Toward an Islamic Enlightenment, the Gülen Movement with Oxford University Press in 2013, Islamic Political Identity in Turkey, also with Oxford in 2003, Secularism and Muslim Democracy in Turkey with Cambridge in 2009, and The Emergence of a New Turkey with the University of Utah in 2007, which he edited. He's also the author of more than 30 articles on Islam, nationalism, the Kurdish question, and modern Turkish politics. If you could unmute yourself, Hakan, we look forward to your remarks. Hakan, you have to unmute yourself. Unmute. It should be at the bottom left hand. There you are.
I think I did. Okay. Well, thanks again, Jeremy. Since the previous speakers, they did excellent job, I don't have much to add. But what I would like to do is to provide you a counter bottom-up narrative of Hagia Sophia as a narrative constructed by counter-elite. It started actually in 1940s and 50s. It also shows how these ideas constructed in the periphery of the counter-elite eventually becomes a dominant. And this is, I think, the story of Turkey under Erdogan, that the Erdogan is a symptom, outcome of what was going on in the country for a long time. So the Hagia Sophia becomes a site of this discussion or debate between the Kemalist project of nation building versus the Islamic periphery. I would argue that this arrogant attitude of Kemalist reformers, their lack of understanding of the role of tradition, art, literature, and especially a failure to connect with the periphery, somewhat at the core of most of our contemporary problems today. In that sense, what you have, the Hagia Sophia for the Muslim periphery represented a captive soul, or what Necip Fazıl Kısakürek calls captive jami, or a hostage jami, or and then in a way it presented as this victimization of Muslim or destruction of their own memory and their own tradition. So Hagia Sophia has this cultural, it is at the center of this culture war. At the same time, it is at the center of this power war between Black Turks and White Turks at the same time. And what I want to do to examine shortly three major, actually four major Muslim intellectuals or scholars and their view about Hagia Sophia. I want to start with Necip Fazıl, then I want to examine a little bit the view of Said Nursi, and then Mehmet Said Kotku Efendi, who was the Naqshbandi Sheikh of both Erbakan and Turgut Özal, and Erdogan actually initially was part of this Naqshbandi order, but it wasn't good for him, and then he left. Then I want to end my talk with how does reopening a museum as a mosque created another reimagining of Islam by İhsan Eli Açık, because İhsan Eli Açık, more or less left-wing social democrat Muslim intellectual, he says what Fatih did was totally wrong, un-Islamic, and we should use this Hagia Sophia to re-examine our Islamic tradition. So let me start with Necip Fazıl Kısakürek. Necip Fazıl is important because I would consider him the intellectual guru of Erdogan. And today, this whole neo-Ottomanism or Islamism, or more or less shaped by some of the writings of Necip Fazıl Kısakürek. He gave a very powerful speech in 1965 in Istanbul Milli Türk Talebe Birliği, or Turkish National Student Union. And in that talk, it is published actually, called Hagia Sophia Hitabesi. He says in that, I examined actually last night his speech again, he uses Hagia Sophia, he calls it as a captive mosque to indicate that our soul, he says, Hagia Sophia yok edilen kimliğimiz ve ruhumuzun abidesidir. That the Hagia Sophia is a manifestation, or it signifies this destruction of our identity and our soul. So what you have here, this turning Hagia Sophia into a museum by, in 1934 by Mustafa Kemal, or the decision by the cabinet, he takes it as a sign of self-denialism or rejection of the tradition and religion. And then he calls in his speech, he says, they transformed our national here, milli, but the milli could also mean religious as well. The milli görüş, we translate it as national, but you can take this as religious culture. They transformed our national culture into a whorehouse. He says, kerhane. So he uses these very powerful words to confront or deconstruct the Kemalist discourse of modernity or modernism or the reforms in a very negative way. So the Hagia Sophia has been, for this group of intellectuals, a site of delegitimizing, critiquing the Kemalist reform project. This is very important as well. He says, bu cami 126 yıldır işgal altında. So 126 years, he says, Hagia Sophia has been captive, and 126 years, when you look at he refers to Tanzimat, 1839, since onwards, entire project for him is something, a destruction, and the Hagia Sophia very much signifies that destructive modernization or reform project in the Ottoman and the Republican period. And then his talk again ends with Fatih Sultan Mehmet, what he did in terms of the conquest of Istanbul, and then he ends it with Abdülhamid II. Again, Abdülhamid II as the major sultan who tried to bring Islam back into public life. But there is something in his speech here. What you see is that is the Ottomanization of Islam and Islamization of Ottomanism at the same time. So in the Turkish discourse, I would say Ottomanism or Neo-Ottomanism becomes a surrogate identity for Islamism. This wasn't the case because this Neo-Ottoman discourse in my book I tried to examine. There were leftist intellectuals, Kemal Tahir, Ismail Cem, Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar. They also played a very important role, but their main concern was that tradition was necessary for modernity. You cannot have modernization and modernity without tradition. We need to bring this tradition back. I would say this is more or less the idea of Orhan Pamuk as well, this Ottomanism. But then you have also counter-Ottomanism of Necip Fazıl Kısakürek or others, and Erdogan is more or less within the tradition of Necip Fazıl. Now let me examine a little bit Said Nursi, how Said Nursi is the founder of the Nur movement. I would say they used to be very dominant with the Gülen movement, but they still dominate middle and upper middle class. There are different versions of the Nur movement, but the founder was a Said Nursi, a Kurdish Ottoman Republican intellectual. Said Nursi, he calls the conversion, some people ask him question, most of his writings evolve question and answer. So people ask him question about Hagia Sophia. He says, Hagia Sophia, turning it into a museum is a new age of skepticism and the dominance of positivist materialism. And it shows, he says, there is no room for soul. There is no room for our inner self to express. And he calls Hagia Sophia in his answer, he says, Hagia Sophia'nın puthaneye çevrilmesi kabul edilemez. Puthane. He doesn't call a whorehouse, but he calls it a puthane. And I don't know how to translate the puthane. It is something, the put means ideal or the place for
house of idols.
Yes, yes, thank you. So, and then he says, this Hagia Sophia, the current situation is also a gift of God that indicates that what we lost and what we need to do. It is a reminder of that what we're supposed to do and how the space is empty now without soul. But he doesn't demand it to be turned into a mosque. He says, ibadet haneye çevrilmeli. And then he says, also in his answer, it could be used as a church as well. For Muslims, it could be used for church as well. He doesn't want to make it as mosque necessarily, but his main issue is anti-religion, not necessarily Islam, but this Kemalist, positivist, Jacobinist attempt to get rid of any room for soul or religiosity. And now, Said Nursi in 1957, he wrote a letter to Adnan Menderes. Adnan Menderes was the prime minister at that time. He asked him to restore, get rid of the museum status of Hagia Sophia and turn it into a religious space, but he also calls a jami. It should become a jami in his letter in 1957, what he calls Adnan Menderes to do. Now, the third person, I just want to, Mehmet Zahid Kotku. Mehmet Zahid Kotku is, I would say, more important than Said Nursi when it comes to politics, because Kotku was a government functionary imam in Iskandar Pasha in Istanbul, but he was the most prominent Naqshbandi Sufi leader that the Turgut Özal Erbakan, actually, he was the sheikh of Necmettin Erbakan, the founder of the Milli Görüş National Outlook movement in Turkey, and then also Turgut Özal as well. The Kotku was a Caucasian, Circassian himself. His grandfather came from today's Caucasus, so he was also aware of his Caucasian roots as well. He did not, his discourse of Hagia Sophia was that it has become a strange place. Garip bir yer oldu. Garip bir yer oldu. And by garip, he means that it somewhat made an empty space and disconnected from its sacred function. And he doesn't get into what needs to be done, or he doesn't, but he's also, you can see that he's also critical, but his, one of his followers, Erbakan, was very much active along the line of the Necip Fazıl to reconvert Hagia Sophia into a mosque. Now, after the opening of the mosque, I think Erdogan, he was joined when he was young Iskandar Pasha for several years. I have just finished a new book on Erdogan. It is coming out from Edinburgh University Press in March. I examined his personality, his childhood, but he was for a while within the framework, within the order of Mehmet Said Kutku, but he left. But Erdogan's worldview is more shaped by Necip Fazıl Kısa Kürek, more confrontational, but the Necip Fazıl was an ideologue of resentment, or he created this ideology of resistance against Kemalism, and in a very effective way, because he was a poet, he knew how to use the words to deconstruct and criticize what happened to Hagia Sophia. But at the same time, during this period in 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there was no scholarly work by secular intellectuals, unfortunately, to make an argument what happened, why it happened. So this space left to these counter-Muslim elite to develop their own ideas. There was no resistance or critique or response by Turkey's secular establishment. Now, after Erdogan opened, I expected him to do it, but I did not expect him to do it in 2020. I expected him to do it in much later period, but he did it because it was one of the goals of the Necip Fazıl and Erdogan as well. But the Hagia Sophia became, some part of Hagia Sophia became a mosque in 1991. During the Bosnian War, there were a number of demonstrations in Istanbul, and it's after the 1990, also the destruction of the mosque, that how it was played in Turkey, during that context, historical or political context, in 1991, some parts of Hagia Sophia became a space for Cuma namazı, for the Friday prayers. And in, but it didn't have imam, but they did appoint an imam before 2020. There was an imam of Hagia Sophia. Now, when the mosque, the museum turned into a mosque, and Erdogan very much, led the prayer session on that Friday, there was another argument. This is argument by İhsan Ali Açık. He criticized what Fatih Sultan Mehmet did. He said what Fatih did was un-Islamic. It has nothing to do with Islam. It was wrong, and we should not insist on this wrong policy. And he even called it barbarism to turn a church into a mosque. And he said this is an opportunity for us as Muslims to rethink what happened to Islam, how Islam has been politicized, and how could we free the ethical, moral dimension of Islam from this political struggle. So he was, and then this is the most important part. He says, Erdoğan İslam'ı taşlarda arıyor. The Erdoğan is searching Islam in the stones, since he could not Islamicize our morality and soul and our heart. And he says, bu İslamlaştırma çabası Müslüman kardeşlerin projesidir. This Islamization project of trying to Islamicize the stone rather than soul and heart, that he says he failed. This is more or less this political vision of Islam, is the legacy or the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is the İhsan Eli Açık statement. To conclude, I don't want to take your time too much. I think what you have here, that this how the Hagia Sophia has always been at the center of counter-Islamic discourse, but the Hagia Sophia also provides a space of Ottomanization of the Islam in Turkey as well. You have this Turkish Islam rooted in the Ottoman legacy or filtered through the Ottoman institutions, but Hagia Sophia remained a burning issue in this cultural struggle in the country, and I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hakan. I'm in the process of reading Nostalgia for the Empire at the moment, and this seems like a nice addition to the chapter where you discuss Necip Fazıl and Said Nursi as well. It's interesting to think about Eli Açık, whom I had the opportunity to interview once myself. He doesn't play that Ottoman game in the same way. But we've now actually reached almost the very limit of our time. I want to thank each of our 5 wonderful speakers. Again, I hope that we'll be able to spend a little bit more time together, though of course I understand if any of you have to leave. That said, I want to offer each of you the opportunity to make maybe a few remarks in response to one another's presentations. So maybe we can just begin from Karen again, if you have anything you'd like to add, and I'll remind you to unmute yourselves as ever. And then we already have a few questions coming in as well. So if you have questions in the audience, just post them to the chat and we'll create a queue.
Thank you to all of you, and thank you, Jeremy, for organizing this. But the presentations were really unbelievable. All of my colleagues, I thank you for. I've learned so much. And I'm a little worried because I didn't really develop everything I wanted to say. But I want to actually say that Hakan's presentation really is part of the particular gap he talks about in the fact that the Kemalists made the museum into, made the mosque into a museum and made a statement, but then abandoned the whole project, and that there was no really secularist narrative about Hagia Sophia, gave the opportunity to the counter-Islamic movement to capture it. And that's what the point that I wanted to make about that period. He did it beautifully in the sense that he told everything else that was on the other side. And this is the part that I think is a big gap in the secular. It was a big gap in the secularist project. But the other thing I want to say is that in all of this conversation, one of the things that we haven't really looked at is the way in which people appropriated the space. And that's the other part that I wanted to mention. When actually the Hagia Sophia became a museum, yes, it was a message to the minorities that they had been subdued. But there was a counter message on the part of the minorities. They went back to the space as a museum. I know because I also lived it, and I know the Greek and the Jewish communities and the way in which people flocked to the museum and told themselves, whether it was to tourists or to their children or to the narratives of Byzantium and the Ottoman, and made their own reappropriation of the space as a sacred space and as a kind of a shared space between civilizations. So at every moment, people understood it differently and appropriated differently. That's the other part that is missing, I think, in this discourse that we need to think about. And I appreciate everybody's conversation, presentation, sorry, tremendously. It was a superb meeting. So that's my point.
Thank you so much, Karen. I think this sort of historical ethnography of the experience of the space is something that we're only just scratching the surface of, indeed. Axel, do you have any comments for us, if you'd like to unmute?
Sure. I'd also like to state that all these presentations were tremendous. I think we've gotten a really wide spectrum of perspectives as well as subjects. And honestly, you know, even if it was just the 5-6 of us, we could go for, 10 years talking about these things. There's so much material. I wanted to address something, well, two things actually. Now, as far as the way that the minorities interacted with the Hagia Sophia, which is what Karen was just talking about, it's important to see that people have agency, of course. When we talk about institutions and policies and so on and so forth, sometimes that agency of the people gets lost in that discussion. And we need some time to think about that, to expand on that. But the thing is, when it comes to agency, yes, I agree with what Karen said, that some people interacted with Hagia Sophia and defined it on their own terms. But this is also taking place in the context of the Republic, and whichever period of the Republic that we're looking at, we also are looking at people who are constantly losing their possessions, constantly being deprived of certain rights, whether that's through pogroms like the 6-7 September events, or more clearly official policies and so on. Not to say that the 6-7 September wasn't official. So it's a mixed bag. It's not one thing versus the other thing. The other thing that I've been thinking about is when I was listening to Bissera's excellent presentation, and I was really, stunned by the sound that she played. I had not come across that on Spotify or anywhere else. I really appreciated that. I immediately connected that idea, for example, to how travelers for centuries and centuries who came to Constantinople talk about or write about the experience of the city, going through the, of course, the Great Walls, the Theodosian Walls, through the markets where all kinds of things go on, all kinds of languages are spoken, a cosmopolitan reality. And then finally, that journey ends at the ceremonial spaces of the empire, including the Hippodrome, the Hagia Sophia. Many of them go in there and are, struck, by awe with, and they describe their feelings and thoughts. But it's not quite the same thing as hearing the sound in the Hagia Sophia. So there's something tremendously important in that. I want to ask Bissera, though, since sound arrangements or how sound works in a building, in architecture, is almost never accidental. It's almost always intentional. Do you know if this was intentional? I mean, do we know Isidore and Anthemius and all the other people who made various alterations to the building later on, to the new dome, etc.? Did they have an actual design? Because from what I think of Byzantine sources, from what I can remember, obviously I cannot remember all of them, but I don't remember any mentions where it was spoken of as a feature, a design feature of the space. Do you have any knowledge of anything like that?
The brief answer is we have some indication, it's not very direct, that Anthemius of Tralles and Isidoros of Miletus were their written work, because they were professors of engineering in a sense, and Anthemius was at the academy in Alexandria. They wrote treatises that were studying the reflection of sunlight, and because sound and light as waves behave in similar way, it is possible to deduce that their interest in the behavior of sun rays will affect their thinking about acoustics. And we also know that Anthemius, when he lived in Constantinople, he had problems with his neighbor, and he was known as like the Hollywood version of special effects. He created a steam machine that will produce the sound and the trembles of earthquake to scare his neighbor. We don't know exactly what the problem was between them, but Anthemius didn't stay within boxed requirements. He really pushed forward. And we have Paul the Silentiary, who says, "Who will sing with the gaping mouths of Homer, the marble meadows assembled on the wall, or the haltingly high nows?" That's what he says, and which means that he draws attention to the reflective surfaces of marble and to the volume of the space, the empty volume. So we have, and then Maximus the Confessor speaks about the megalophonia, the reverberation of the divine voice. So these are the bits and pieces that we have, because medieval architecture and ancient architecture is not defined by function. Function is a modern concept. So what we see is there is a progression of experimentation from the Küçük Hagia Sophia, Sergius and Bacchus, to Hagia Sophia, of buildings that are consistent of several volumes that are enclosed within each other, that allow for long reverberation time, because energy doesn't dissipate the way it will dissipate in a basilica. And here, in a sense, all the energy is reflected back into the center, which was so significant. So that's the trouble, in a sense, of studying studies of acoustics in the ancient and medieval period, because the type of texts that we want are not there. But maybe this is a point that I would like to draw. So much of our work has been guided by positivism, in a sense, and a building like Hagia Sophia completely dashes this. And it shows that this emotional, spiritual aspect really trumps everything else. And once, in a sense, it allows you to be absorbed, to be sensorially invested in that interior. And we can use logic, and the logic says that the cathedral chant progressed in the direction of make it even more obfuscated, the meaning. But we don't have the type of text that we want to have, saying that Anthemius stated that he was interested in reverberant acoustics. We don't have that.
Thank you, Bissera.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Bissera, and thank you, Axel. I think Emily, you're next in the queue. If you have any comments before we open it up to a few more questions, as long as people can stay with us, of course.
Sure, and I'd like to leave some time for that. But yeah, I also want to thank everyone for their presentations. I think there was a really nice diversity. We covered a lot of ground, which is great. And something that I'd like to pick up on was a point made in the last presentation by Hakan about, the fact that this basically was a mosque, starting all the way in 1991, and then there was the gradual the call to prayer started, I can't remember, 2012, 2013, something like that. When back in July, I heard a lot of opinions running something to the effect of, well, this is a UNESCO World Heritage Monument, it can't possibly be a mosque. And that's sort of, there's a lot behind that assumption that I think is problematic. And and to some extent, the fact that the, Turkish courts adjudicated the status of the mosque sort of frames the discussion, inherently that this is something, it has to be this or that. But I think if we just sort of resist that, and we see that in the functioning of the museum itself, that it was a museum and a mosque for at least, for at least 30 years before its reconversion, that, I mean, I think we can see the possibilities that it's not necessarily problematic or difficult to, you know, and now I sort of think it was a museum that was also a little bit of a mosque, and now it's a mosque that I guess is going to be a little bit of a museum. But we really do, I still think that we really do need to be pressing, you know, not just talking about the symbolism, but really, you know, who has access to this building, and what is going on inside, and what is being done to the building. Really asking very pointed, you know, direct questions about what's actually being done to the monument. And we really need to stay on task to sort of stay focused on that. That's what I would urge.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you also for the leading role that you've had in making that point publicly. I think it's really admirable and crucial that we have people like you, scholars and activists, reminding us that the structures that we take for granted because they are built with mortar and brick and stone are themselves potentially ephemeral if we don't care for them. Bissera, Axel, oh.
Yes, just a very short thing, if I may.
Please.
I was going to mention this, but I forgot as I was listening to Bissera. So as far as what can be done, should be done, you know, looking to the future aspect of this, well, I don't want to call it a building. It's more than a building, this phenomenon, maybe. Whatever is done, whatever, you know, whatever direction is taken in the future, I would like to, you know, point out that it probably should not be done from the top in a Jacobin fashion, you know, in a way that dictates things for everyone involved, because that didn't work. we see that didn't work. It's still not working right now. Of course, what's the alternative to that, you might ask? You know, what about the people of Turkey, what they think, and so on and so forth? But that goes back to how identity is being constructed. If we have a discussion about identity, if the people of Turkey, for example, and they're not the only party to this discussion, I'm just mentioning them right now, but if they feel that this is also their Byzantine church, that their Byzantine Empire built this church, and it has a function like that, it is theirs in that sense. It can change that discussion to some extent. So it's not going to be from the top, even within the specific boundaries of Turkey. Of course, it's a much wider discussion. So that was what I was going to say. Thank you.
Somehow, Axel, you summon images of Erdogan embodying a Neo-Byzantine as well as your Ottoman sovereignty.
A Neo-Byzantine empire, yes.
I don't know what that would really look or sound like in practice, but Bissera, you answered Axel's question, but did you have other points you wanted to add in reflection?
I also would like to thank all the speakers. I found very insightful this notion of vacuum, that in a sense secularism did not develop a narrative, and therefore it allowed in a sense for other voices to speak. And I am also very intrigued by Yavuz's discussion about some of this, I would say, the Kurdish spiritualist voice within that space, and the Sufi thinker, because I think this notion of Islam as monolith and Turkey being identified with Sunni Islam is something that I find very perturbing, that in a sense, even there, the lack of diversity is shocking. And I want to say something that became clear in the event that I ran at Stanford, that Hagia Sophia acquired a UNESCO status as part of the old fabric of the city, of the old footprint, in a sense, of Constantinople, which means that the entire population in that footprint of Constantinople is part and parcel of the area that is protected by UNESCO. And I have a question to the other speakers in the panel, if they could elucidate for me, to what extent the character of this population has dramatically changed, and many people from the provinces in the past 20 years have been brought and settled in the old Constantinople. I was always shocked when in 2016 I was seeing already some of the changes that are changes on the aesthetics of the experience, with electric light focused on the mihrab and the mimbar, with all the renovation that takes place just of these structures and the cleaning of the 19th century shields. I was surprised that the intelligentsia, they would say, like, I haven't been to Hagia Sophia in 20 years or in 10 years. I'm really perturbed by what you're telling me. In other words, it is not just the lack of narrative, but also the lack of direct engagement with this monument that is left, in a sense, for the new population of Constantinople that doesn't have roots in Constantinople. Maybe I'm making generalizations and some could elucidate that, but I'll leave it to you. So it's a question, in a sense, for Axel, for Hakan, for Emily, and for Karen. Really, who is living in Old Constantinople as part of the UNESCO protected area?
Someone among us must surely, thank you, Bissera, someone must know the exact dimensions of the protected area. I don't know them myself. If it's the entire sort of Tarihi Yarımada, or if it's some version of that, but maybe we can mull over this this question, which I think many of us will have thoughts about. And Hakan, if you have any last comments, and then we also do have a lot of questions coming up now as well.
My last comment is that Hagia Sophia really manifests and signifies this Kemalist project, and it failed to turn it into a proper museum. There was constant construction going on there. There was total, it was ignored. But this is the whole, this Kemalist perception, or its failure to understand this inner self, the soul, and micro spaces that you need to, the humans are not all about interest and materialism. There is also other aspect, emotional, the religious side. I think that whole Hagia Sophia left alone. It wasn't a captive, but it was totally ignored. It was constant projects were going on inside, never finished because there was no enough money from the Ministry of Culture, and an empty space, no soul, no spirit. But they also ignored that the periphery, or people on the other side, were reimagining, reconstructing this Hagia Sophia, and they had their own plans, their own thinking, and it was, I think, totally ignored. I think the Karen's point is very important. This is this failure of the secular elite to really understand the role of the tradition, microspaces. So who lives around Hagia Sophia today are the Black Turks, but mostly Kurds. The rich and wealthy, they usually live in Nişantaşı or some other areas. You have either no mosque or very few mosques. So this is the tragedy of Turkey, that the elite versus the periphery, and then the two different visions and two different clash, and Hagia Sophia is in the middle of this ongoing tension. Let me give you now what is going on in Hagia Sophia. Since it became a mosque, there was a big fight which Jamaat should be the appointed imam. Now the struggle over Hagia Sophia is now over the control, who should be the imam, is the major power struggle among the Jamaat. So what happened, Professor Boynukalın from Marmara University was appointed as the chief imam along with 4 imam. Professor Boynukalın is a member of Erenköy Nakşibendi Sufi order. Another imam appointed, Ferruh Mustuer, he is a member of İskender Pasha order. Another imam appointed, Bünyamin Topçuoğlu. He's also a member of İskender Pasha order. So what you have here, you have 3 imams, but the chief imam is a professor. And then there are 2 other imams. So it is a coalition of Jamaats are now running the show, because it reminds me this church in the Jerusalem, the Holy what's called the Holy Scalpel Church, that the churches they fight who controls the window, who controls the door, who controls the pillar, and then the key of the church, I think, in the hand of some Palestinian Muslim family. So here you have the similar type of local warfare going on among these different Jamaats, because of the attached new meaning to the Hagia Sophia, who should be the imam, chief imam, who should be the hatib, and unfortunately, this is what is going on over there. But I think here something very important, this argument of Ihsan ele Açık, this is something very important. I think he is a left-wing the religious scholar, and then he says what Fatih did was un-Islamic. What Erdogan is doing has nothing to do with Islam. He even went as far as to call it a barbarism, to turn church into a mosque. And then he made his argument on the basis of Islamic sources, and no one could answer his criticism. I think this is something also very important, that it also, Hagia Sophia opened a space for new vision of rethinking what Islam is and what it was and what it should be. I will end here. But I have a question for Kerin. Why do you think, Kerin, the Kemalist elite failed to understand this spiritual, moral aspect of the societal life? Yes. What?
Should I answer, Jeremy? Is it taking, I mean, I think the answer lies in the kind of very modernity-oriented, positivistic, scientific thinking that they embraced for a while, and we've been bombed by an image.
Sorry, this is my fault. Am I muted or unmuted?
You are not muted.
No, the reason I put that up is because it was a request on the part of one of our participants, just as a commemoration of Glee, the beloved feline of Hagia Sophia that sadly passed away recently. So I wanted to put that up just before people have to start leaving. I'm going to stop that now. I think I did maybe chose the wrong moment, but go ahead, Karen.
Who is the beloved feline? I'm not even sure I know what you're talking about.
I don't actually know myself, since I haven't had a lot of time to spend in Hagia Sophia.
I know. And you can recognize these cats also by their vision in which their eyes cross. So you know that it's the family that lives, the cat family that lives in Hagia Sophia. It's very distinctive.
Really?
So yes, I could immediately recognize that.
It's actually a pity that our colleague Kimberly Hart is not with us. She's writing about street cats in Istanbul at the moment. But Karen, please go ahead. I'm going to stop that share. That was just.
I just wanted. There's nothing much more to add on this. It's, I think, a particular vision that they espoused and got stuck with, in a sense, and it reflects itself in, you know, in the high school, in the school books, in the history books, in all of what they produced for the population to take in. We didn't learn about Byzance. We didn't learn about really the antecedents of the Ottomans, except the Turkish antecedents. We didn't really learn beyond also the glory moment of the Ottoman Empire. Every year you started at emergence and you finished at the end of the 16th century. You never really went, and then you had 1 week of everything else. till the War of Independence. That's how I learned Ottoman history too. So it was a way, I think, of putting a project and then getting stuck with it and reproducing it over time, even though Turkey was changing and religion was starting to re-enter, and the arts and culture were flourishing. I think the Kemalist project of the way in which they represented modernity just got stuck and never evolved. And that was we live with those consequences. We really do. So that's my answer to that question.
Thank you, Karen. I should just note that Emily Neumeier has to leave us soon, and we are, of course, past time. But we have a lot of questions, which I think we'll maybe turn to, as long as the other panelists are still open to responding to them to some degree. Maybe we can take two at a time. So Mohammed, I believe you had a question. Remember to unmute your microphone, and then after that, Irena. There are also a lot of questions coming through on the chat, so I'm not sure how we'll manage all of these, but we'll do our best.
Yes, do you hear me, Jeremy? Yes, thank you very much for you, Jeremy, and also to the distinguished speakers, and also many thanks to Max Planck Research Group. Actually, I have a set of questions drawn mainly from the title of the workshop, which is Political, Temporal, and Aesthetic Dimension of Heritage. My questions would be directed to all speakers. And my first question is, why the conversion of Hagia Sophia now? The time aspect. Why is it during the COVID-19 pandemic? Is it that of higher priority to the Turkish government, Turkey, or the Turkish people? And the second question is about any political output of this conversion, whether it's within the internal Turkish or external and foreign, let's say, hegemony, what might people call it. And third and last question is, how we should, as researchers, and especially those who focus on contemporary issues, how we best understand the conversion of Hagia Sophia? Is it as what Axel referred to, the binary aspects, the Christian side, the Muslim side, or should it be understood as whoever wins or whoever has the hegemony of power in the place of Hagia Sophia? That's it.
Thank you, Mohammed. Irena, would you like to ask a question as well before we turn to responses?
Hi, well, basically my question is pretty much the same. I was going to ask the speakers to comment on the timing of this conversion. And of course, thank you very much for your wonderfully interesting presentations.
Would anyone care to respond?
Sure, I could try. So as far as timing, I mean, the most obvious answer there is that it has a lot to do with domestic politics. It has a lot to do with Erdogan choosing his moment in a way that would, this sort of act would benefit him the most. Now, having said that, let's not just reduce it to that, because there's also a tendency in the media and the public when they discuss this to reducing it just into a sort of short-term political goal, and that was all there was to it, and so on. It isn't. There's much more to it, as we've been discussing. There's things that have been building up for decades, but certainly there's as far as the timing, the domestic politics aspect comes up. And I think that also leads to one last thing, which is connected to these questions and thinking. We all sort of take the Hagia Sophia for granted. And what I mean by that is that we almost sort of, in our minds, we think that it will always be there. But if you think about it, that's not really true, is it? I mean, it is in a place, it is in a location where earthquakes are known, destructive earthquakes are known. About a few months ago, something that was circulated on the media, but not widely actually, was there was a news report that Turkish intelligence had uncovered an ISIS cell that planned to destroy the Hagia Sophia. So, imagine for a moment how we would all feel, regardless of our positions on the Hagia Sophia, if that building went down tomorrow. Feel that for a moment, that hollow space in you. That's something that we all share, and that's something worth thinking about. So, I know that it isn't exactly what was asked, but it is connected, I think, in terms of the longevity of the building. We cannot really assume that it will be there forever. We cannot take it for granted. And yes, I do think that short-term calculations did play a part in the timing, but that's not the only picture.
Well, can I, Jeremy, say a few words to Mohammed's question? I can't hear you.
Yes, please. Yeah. Sorry, I sometimes forget.
Well, I think the timing, this had to happen. This is my own reading, that the Erdogan had to, I would say, open, in the sense that given their political discourse, which was how it was constructed, Hagia Sophia was a burning issue. It was always at the center of Islamist discourse. Hagia Sophia for them was the end of the Kemalist era, making it as a mosque, and the beginning of a new Turkey, what they call a new Turkey, with this, Hagia Sophia had a symbolic meaning for Turkish Islamic discourse, I would say. This is one thing. But why in 2020, I think there are E-Party, the opposition party, brought a motion to the parliament. And Erdogan actually, a year before, he said it should be kept as, when people ask him, when are you going to open Hagia Sophia as a mosque, his response was that, look at the next door, the Sultan Ahmet Cami, say it is empty. First you fill that mosque, we don't need another mosque. This was his response at that time. But in E-Party, the opposition party brought a motion to the floor in the Turkish parliament. They said the government to re-examine and then open the museum and convert the museum into a mosque. And then that put a pressure. So they are the one actually pulled this trigger. And then Erdogan, he said, well, it is not up to me, it is up to the court. And then they pursued that process of the court, but the court made the decision certainly on the basis of the wishes of Erdogan, because Erdogan controls, he's more powerful than God in Turkey now. So he very much, the court went alone. And I think it had to do with this internal power struggle. And then he was also under the economy is not in good shape in the country, but it backfired. What he expected to get out of Hagia Sophia, it really didn't materialize in terms of, if you look at the polls, it did not have much impact. People didn't care. On the contrary, more people said, address our economic problems rather than leave these stones or the mosque or the church and museum aside. So it did not bring him what he expected to get. That's, yeah.
Thank you, Hakan. We're now sadly beginning to lose some of our participants. I know Karen also informed me she had to leave. I think we'll take one more question, and then we've already taxed your time and your patience and your attention too much, I'm sure. Nora, I think you've been waiting in the queue for a while, even though you just lowered your hand virtually. But would you like to ask a final question, and then maybe we can proverbially wrap things up?
Sure. Thank you so much for convening this extraordinary panel. In a time of great flux, you've kind of brought us a certain sense of centeredness, if not although a very contested one, and a sense of connectedness to something that is, proved resilient for millennia. I truly hope that Axel fears are not realized in terms of the longevity of Hagia Sophia. But I did want to ask a question about temporalities. What I was really struck across the presentations was the sense of sort of cosmic connectedness and depth that the building has been able to evoke for most of its history in those who participate in the spaces in Byzantium, during the Ottoman Empire, and that sense of sort of cosmic rupture that it evoked in the Islamist intellectuals of the Republic. And what I find puzzling today is that this new project of inscribing Hagia Sophia as a ethno-religious nationalist space, very much underscored by the process that Professor Yavuz just described of the role that E-Party played in catalyzing the decision to convert it into a mosque right now. And there just seems to be a real paradox there, because the religious element of the project seeks to reconnect with the sacred and with the cosmic and with kind of eternal time, but the nationalist dimension of the project is, is very linear and very much kind of predicated on a sense of sort of manifest destiny and an expansionary project of reprojecting an imagined kind of neo-Ottoman hegemony in the country and the region. I just wondered if you could speak to that, and also I'm sad that Professor Barkey had to leave us. Speak to the way that potentially ordinary people, as they continue to participate in this space, may respond to and contest and reappropriate and transform that tension between an attempt to reconnect with the eternal, that is in fact very, very very mundane, very, very, very nationalist and very worldly in its intentions.
Thank you, Nora. I also will take just a moment to say that your gesture to Karen's work also reminds me that one of our participants, Zeynep, I believe, there are probably several Zeyneps, but wanted me to point out that the gif of glee that she shared was not so much about the cuteness, but rather about that sort of appropriation on a daily basis of the space by human and indeed non-human denizens of Hagia Sophia. So maybe a few last remarks from any of the three of you, Bissera, Axel, and Hakan, and then we can finally call it a night, although I'm sure we could continue speaking for a very long time if we had the opportunity.
Well, it braces me with new hope to hear about the Kurdish and the Sufi critique of the reconversion that lacks a soul, that Erdogan is claiming stones but not hearts and souls. And I think this is a really important point. And also a little bit to Mohammed's question, there are ways in which Christianity and Islam could coexist in that space and really feed on the best aspects of these two religions, but it has not been used. Reading the Fatiha, for instance, as a surah in Hagia Sophia is not as powerful, according to me, as reading the Surat al-Nur. I think this could have done much better in that space. And because there, in terms of shared light, and Hagia Sophia transforms Muslim worship from spaces that are relatively dark. If we look at the mosque at Damascus and the mosque at Cordoba, most of the light, because these are hypostyle halls, most of the light is very limited, and it's mostly from the southern wall, from the wall of the mihrab. It means that you enter into these large hangar spaces where there is no light. Hagia Sophia, with its central dome and with light that rotates around in a circle 360 degrees, transformed the perception of what a prayer space is. And not surprisingly, the Ottoman mosques follow this example, and they refine Hagia Sophia because Süleymaniye is bringing the light to the lower levels, the way Hagia Sophia did not. Because in Hagia Sophia, there is mystical light, superstructure. It is inundated with light, and then you have the lower part, which is the marble, the body, the corporeal, in a sense, part is in darkness. Süleymaniye light streams from the level of the garden, and that's very significant. So I'm all for ways in which these two religions could speak to each other, but I'm also for harmony. And what is so pervasive, I think, in AKP's use of cultural heritage, it uses cultural heritage to re-victimize and re-wound rather than to heal. So this is very disturbing. And the example of Hagia Sophia is the most recent one, but this critique is also there when one looks at Ani, focusing on the Seljuk part rather than, so there's so many examples of this manipulation, using the stones to wound bodies, but not using, in a sense, the stones to open the souls and the hearts. And I'm speaking as a Byzantinist who studied Arabic, who is very much interested in this dialogue, and where many of my students are surprised at the end that there are so many shared, in a sense, beliefs rather than division, and they have learned only about division. So cultural heritage is a powerful, I'm sorry, these are leaves blowers outside. Cultural heritage is a powerful political tool, but the way it has been used in Turkey today is for division. And that's disturbing, and I think that's where what Karen spoke of, why this secularist elite is not speaking, is very disturbing, because that's something they could speak about. This use of cultural heritage for division. We all lose at the end. As what Axel said, the emptiness, a building that is gone would open in our heart. So, that's all.
I think there was a question by Dr. Corlu that this ongoing conquest, this whole celebration of the conquest of Istanbul or the cities, why that's going on. I was also thinking that issue. I think it had to do with this anxiety, that the anxiety in terms of we need some kind of myth that we are all one and same, and we did not mix with others, that we are pure. We came from Central Asia around 8th, 9th century, and we are the same people. But we all know that we are all mixed. When we talk one-to-one in our private life, we know our grandmother is Bosnian, his grandfather is a Kurd, or Cherkess, or Chechen. So Turkey is a nation of nationalities. Turkey is a nation of refugees. These are Muslim refugees, and some of them are the convert to Islam, the indigenous local population of Greeks, the Armenians, or some other groups, whatever you call. So I think on one hand, this awareness that we are not what we claim to be, that we are not pure. On the other hand, that we want to be pure, not mixed. It creates this incredible tension. And this tension, I think, manifests itself with this conquest thinking that we celebrate as if we are the same people. We came from the Central Asia. But we all know, I'm sure you know as well, when you are in Turkey, when you talk with the people, people do say, I am a Circassian, I am this, I am that. And then you would hardly find a Turk. Maybe the original Turk is the Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. He himself very much a mixture of different things. So just a suggestion, I also think why this conquest, it goes on. I don't know, that's the only thing comes to my mind. That, but the Hagia Sophia, I would say we should not read too much of it as well. The reconversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque, I think from my own thinking and my own reading, it was going to happen. It really, it's an important event, yes, but it was really an empty, useless space as a museum. They could not take it properly as a museum either. There was constant construction. It was left alone in a way. It was, I don't know how to put it, but I'm not saying that the conversion will make it better, but what it wasn't really inspiring either. That's all I would end there.
Thank you, Hakan. Acaba Atatürk öz Türk mü, öz Makedonyalı mı?
Arnavut mu, Yunan mı?
Öz, problem özdür. Problem özdür.
Yes.
I would like to say something because Hakan, what he said at the end is something that I find disturbing. The museum was not given a chance. And there is a succession of directors that took place that really brought about the weakening of what this museum could be. The problem is not with the scaffolding that was in the building. Actually, the building is a continuous need of structural reinforcement. The problem right now is that the scientific committee that is overseeing this work is ousted. They're not consulted as changes are made. That is really perturbing. And the museum is really the only option to upkeep the historical value, the age value of a monument, the historical age value of a monument. I think there is a lot of opportunity to expand on that. If there is an interest, it just never came to that. It was driven into the ground. But the type of research that I was able to do will be impossible right now, which means that it's not only that Byzantium, the traces of Byzantium are not visible because the mosaics are covered, because the floor is covered, because as a woman, I don't have a chance to walk where I would like to walk. But now even this type of research is just impossible to do. What is beyond the eyes eventually becomes beyond emotional, spiritual investment in. So I see I see that this decision is detrimental. And also I think that Turkey for years is struggling with memory because the changes of transformation, the establishment of the Republic is about the cutting of the roots, the cutting of a language, the cutting of an alphabet. And in a sense, you create a very dangerous population because it's disconnected from its past. And now you can manipulate this population. And with more demagogical regimes, the ones that we're seeing right now, it's more successful. So I think the question of history and memory is always there. And there is no perfect solution, but the museum was a rapprochement of coming together. And who was the director of the museum really mattered. There was a moment in which Haluk Dursun was the director of the museum. That was the moment when Icons of Sound received permission to work. And immediately after he left to become the director of Topkapı, there were changes and we were not given permission to work. So we have, in a sense, material evidence that survives from over 1,500 years and we have no access to it.
Thank you, Bissera. This is really, I think, crucial to keep in mind that there are consequences, very practical, on the type of research that can be conducted, and therefore what images of the space and place become dominant or even available. Axel, I don't know if you want to make any last comments. We've really gone beyond time, of course, which I think is a testament to all of you and also to the topic, hopefully. But maybe a few words and then we'll sign off.
Yep, I'll be very brief, very short. I just didn't want to leave what Nora and Dr. Yavuz said unanswered. With what Nora said, I think that if we're going to start working on this complicated knot of nationalism, Islamism, and a whole bunch of other things being involved, if we're going to start pulling, strands from it, I think the nationalist one gives us far more efficient ways of untangling that knot rather than the Islamist or various other things, because you really cannot find a lot of ideologies in Turkey in the last 100 years that have not been infused with nationalism at some level to some extent. So the nationalist aspect is where, you know, we do more efficient work, in my opinion. And quickly, as for what Dr. Yavuz said, it's true, people in Turkey are quite aware that they are not one thing, or, you know, most people wouldn't think perhaps that they are some kind of pure Turkish or this and that. At the same time, when I tell people that I'm Armenian, people say Estağfurullah. When I tell people I'm Greek or Levantine, you know, they're like, you know, they take it as an insult almost, you know, please don't take that as an insult, they say, and so on. So there are limits to how much of that sort of, oh, we're all mixed and so on, you know, is there. And that can only change through time, through more discussion. The more we talk about these things, the more, you know, we have openings for that.
Thank you so much. I think that's a nice note to close on. Thanks to the 5 of you and the 3 of you that have remained for the entire time. It's been a really, I think, eye and ear opening conversation, and one that will surely continue. I want to thank again the members of my group, particularly Cicek and Jelena, who've been with us this whole time and who just did a fantastic job really conceptualizing this far more so than I did, and Marina as well, who makes all of this possible. I want to also conclude by wishing all of you safety in these difficult times, and especially to those of you who have family and friends in Izmir. I hope they're doing okay. And thank you again, Smirna, Izmir. Thank you again. My phone is ringing, which means my time is up. Thank you again, and I look forward to the continuation of all of this in the near future.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.